right over to Daniella Lowenberg and Iratxe Puebla, who are talking about what I said before, which is building trust. So why don't you go jump right in, because we're really pushing our limits on time here.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you to Harvard Data Science Review for having us here today. I'm Iratxe Puebla, Director of Make Data Count. This is an initiative that has the goal of developing data metrics to enable responsible assessment and evaluation of the reach and impact of open data. And we do this by supporting open infrastructure as well as community efforts, workflows, practices, and evidence to better understand how open data is being used. I'm going to be co-presenting with the co-author of the perspective piece that we contributed to the specialist, Daniella Lowenberg, who is going to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Daniella Lowenberg, Senior Advisor for Data Governance at Administration for Children and Families, here representing in my role as an advisor to the Make Data Count initiative.
Wonderful. So to dive right in, we are going to be speaking about the vision that we have for assessment of open data and why in that paper, we talk about data metrics as an important point for responsible data stewardship. So we've seen a lot of developments and great progress in supporting open data over the last decade or so. And I would particularly highlight that there's been great efforts in supporting skills and tools for data stewardship, particularly to enable access to data. What we want to discuss today is that we need to move data stewardship beyond data access and start to get a better understanding of different aspects of what happens with that open data that is being shared. There are many things that have improved, as I mentioned, in terms of sharing open data, but we also know that there are aspects that we need to work on further. One of them relates to the discoverability of open data. This is not yet necessarily the norm. There are some gaps in terms of how researchers can gain access to the latest outputs, including data set. How do we embed open data in the tools and workflows that they use? We had an example in the paper about the fact that only a tiny minority of ORCID records have links to data sets, but we know that the majority of researchers produce data sets. So there are better ways in which we can work to embed open data sets into these platforms and services that researchers use on their day-to-day. The other important aspect that tends to come up in discussions about open data is the fact that we are currently in a place where research assessment frameworks are still very heavily focused on publications, generally peer-reviewed journal articles and books, and very few specifically signal open data as something that is considered and rewarded as part of those research evaluation exercises. And we're going to have to tackle this problem if we want to start giving credit to the data producers, but also encourage these best practices around data sharing, essentially incentivize others to also share more of the data they produce. So essentially, we are making the case that data stewardship needs to extend beyond data access. And we need to start having this common and shared and collective understanding as to which data should be made open and for what purposes, which data sets are being used, which ones are particularly highly used, perhaps within certain disciplines or across disciplines, and also which data sets we would expect to see utilized, but we are not seeing that use. So essentially, we need to better understand how we can support the better use of those open data sets by the specific communities, researchers, administrators that need it. If we are to better understand how are we really building this progress towards faster and better research discovery and translating all of this into societal benefit. At Make Data Count, we believe that we need to support this evaluation of data usage by having data metrics that are both transparent and responsible. And I wanted to spend just a few, maybe less than a minute, giving you a brief overview of what we mean by data metrics in this context. As you can see from our paper, we describe data metrics as meaningful and contextualized quantitative or qualitative measures of how open data sets are accessed or utilized. And there are a few things that we believe need to be covered if we are going to actually have and develop data metrics that support responsible evaluation of data. One of the things that we highlight is the need to have not only counts of how data sets are being used, but having normalized counts of that usage across platforms, because we need to not only get a sense of how specific data sets are being used or what's happening in specific repositories or data publishing platforms, but be able to get that collective picture across platforms, across the research and administrative ecosystem. So important for the data metrics to be based on normalized counts. And also, when we talk about metrics, we do this in the plural. We believe we need to have a different set of metrics that will be useful for different stakeholders, for different uses, and in ways in which we can account for example, for the disciplinary differences in the production and usage of data. Obviously, the practice for producing and using data is very different, perhaps from genomics to social sciences. We need to be able to account for that, to have a contextualized picture of data uses. And we also need to start having more nuanced axis of value around the use of data sets. Some data sets, they may not be accessed by many, but they are key data sets for certain communities, certain groups. And this is something that we should also try to build as part of the suite of metrics that we will develop to evaluate data usage. And we believe this should be a pressing priority right now, and that we should not delay it further. So I'll hand over to Daniella to talk more about prioritizing data metrics.
Thanks. So after walking through in our paper why we're building the case for it, we go through to discuss that in September, we held our first ever summit in DC, and it gave us the first time to convene government agencies and those involved in scholarly research to tackle all the nuanced issues and importance of data metrics. And the common themes throughout that summit was universal agreement on the need for evaluations of data usage at agencies and institutions, and how important responsible approaches to those are, and an emphasis on the questions that are trying to be answered by these evaluations, what the metrics may be meaningful for. If you click next, Iratxe. We announced yesterday we're hosting the summit for the second time. It'll be at the Wellcome Trust in London, September 5th to 6th, with a more global focus as opposed to US policy focused. Next slide. So infrastructure has evolved substantially over the last few years, and we really want to focus on not needing to reinvent the wheel, but rally behind initiatives that have gained community support and traction for this. For example, implementing data usage standards, persistent identifier adoption that's going to help build these linkages, more bibliometric studies to identify what's incomplete, and prioritizing the usage of AI and machine learning to surface how these data sets are found. Click next, like the democratizing data that Julia and Nancy have talked about, and the data citation corpus that make data count hosts at DataCite. Next slide. We can also build on existing cultural momentum right now, as groups in government and academia are increasingly looking to update their evaluation frameworks to deliver a more equitable assessment of administrative and researcher use, which will give a better, more holistic understanding of the reach of these activities. So of course, the policies here in the US that state that, but also evaluation framework reform here and in Europe. And so we state that updates to these evaluation frameworks, whether for evaluation at the administrative level or in research, should include data in that, understanding how data are produced, and reporting on usage and reach of them. Next slide. So we really wanted to reframe challenges that come into this as prompts. Next slide. And these were the priorities that we state and that came from the summit. So bibliometric studies to understand how data are found and used, by whom, understanding barriers to accessibility and discoverability, optimizing to understand what is missing. So what data sets are not being used, which data users are underserved, and prioritizing, making sure that we understand nuances in data usage, including differences between raw data and aggregate data, the relation to each other, the reuse of dynamic and operational data as opposed to just static archive data sets. Next slide. We close with a reminder that the driving force behind all these efforts needs to be synergistic with the needs for data producers and reusers, which is trust, building trust with them, heeding warnings to avoid box metrics that could lead us to unintended or ill-desired behavior and harmful outcomes for research and policy. Next slide. And our concluding statement is to get to this place where administrative data and research data are evaluated and reused to enhance discovery policy. We have to move away from the last decade's focus on data sharing writ large and put a dedicated lens on data metrics. Thanks so much.